Hello there, it is a Tuesday, which means it's time for another in real life video. This week, we're taking another gentle viewer submitted question, submitted from a gentle viewer just like you. And of course, you like that? But you can feel free to submit a future question that we can answer or whatever in a future one of these. We're getting quite the list. Maybe before long, we will actually do 2 of these per week. That way we can get through the list. But regardless, this week's, and of course, always helps if you include a question mark, but this week's comes from a gentle viewer whose username should be somewhere in the bottom third, right about now, and they ask, let me check here real quick, they ask, in role-playing games, what kind of leveling system resonates with you the most? Skill allotment, new abilities, scale through use, etc. I think this is a complicated question, or at least more complicated than it seems from the get-go. That being because the leveling system should suit the type of role-playing game at hand, right? First and foremost. And I think for the most part, a lot of them do suit the type of role-playing game it is, right? For instance, Elder Scrolls, that being leveling through use, that's the prime example of it. There's many other role-playing games nowadays, and adjacent games, right, that just have a role-playing game like progression skill system that sort of mimic what, I don't know if it was originally, but it was the main, sort of game that kind of had it, right? Where you use a skill, your character gets better at it. Probably other games that have used it before that, but like I said, Elder Scrolls specifically was kind of the big one that had it from the start, right? It's one of the main champions of that, I guess you could say. But that sort of skill system very much suits that type of role-playing game, wherein it's kind of a role-playing game meets immersive sim. It's very much about sort of experiencing this sandbox and whatnot, so it makes sense. If you're going through a sandbox and you're sort of, you're tooling around with being a thief, right? You go join the Thieves Guild. There's not really anything that limits you from joining the Thieves Guild, but it works out very well, wherein you join a Thieves Guild, you get better at thief skills, or at the very least, whatever skills you want to use within that Thieves Guild, right? You could be a thief who's not good at being a thief. You would get better at that. You would get better at doing, whatever type of combat you want. Maybe you're a sort of thief who uses a lot of illusion magic, right? If you keep doing that in the Thieves Guild, you are becoming a better thief, but you are becoming a better, your type of thief specifically. And it feels very natural. You sort of unlock more perks, or you sort of advance in this, you unlock more whatever in it. It opens up the sandbox more and more the more you play with certain toys within the sandbox, right? If we think about every skill within a sort of immersive sim sandbox role-playing game as its own toy, you get better the more you play with them, right? You unlock new possibilities, more stuff, more ways to have fun with it, and you can figure out ways in which you can combine different toys together and whatnot, and have them work out that way. Very enjoyable. I don't know that kind of system really works outside of a immersive sim role-playing game. I don't think that sort of leveling system works. For instance, in Baldur's Gate 3, we're playing that right now. I don't think that would function very well. Maybe in an action role-playing game, that could work, right? That could work more in an action role-playing game or something like that. But even then, that sort of limits you when it comes to experimenting, right? Which is sort of the joy and fun of that. In an action role-playing game, for instance, is being able to, or I guess in a more traditional action role-playing game, that being like a Diablo, a Path of Exile, they offer you different ways in which you can experiment and sort of see the ways in which your action role-playing game character leveling and progression feels very different. But yeah, I think it really depends. But if we sort of go broader with that, if we sort of pull back a little bit and think more broadly, I don't know. Probably my favorite are ones that sort of hold true to, I would say what a lot of people who design role-playing games would say are like the tenets of character building and progression in any sort of role-playing game, right? Whether that be like an immersive sim sandbox kind, an action role-playing game, or even one like, like a more traditional narrative role-playing game or whatever, wherein it affects a lot of your dialogue decisions and whatnot. But there needs to be a good balance between, I think, achieving some sort of archetype, some sort of letting the player fulfill some sort of player fantasy within that world, and then also allowing for experimentation and sort of going beyond the purview. Or maybe this last part is more my favorite. I like it when games let me sort of experiment and tinker around with stuff more. Like I said, it's not even necessary because I play and enjoy a lot that don't do this, but I love it when there's just that room for tinkering. Like, for example, something that I really like is in Path of Exile, there are these sorts of skill gems, right? And you can attach different gems to them to make a skill behave in a certain way. So, for instance, if you're unfamiliar, you shoot out a fireball. You could attach another gem to the fireball gem and make it shoot out 3 fireballs, right? Or you could attach one that makes it into a landmine, and then when an enemy walks over the landmine, a fireball comes out. Or you could make it to where you shoot one fireball still, but when it explodes at the end, it explodes twice as big as normal, And then on top of that, on top of these changes, you could add on literally all of them at the same time. So you put down a landmine that explodes into 4 different fireballs that all explode twice as big as you would expect, right? And there's different checks and balances going on, keeping everything sort of like toned down in a certain way. That's sort of the exciting thing about that sort of action role-playing game space, right? But it is important, of course, I think, to have some sort of player fantasy, even if that is as simple as like, oh, I want to be a wizard that throws fireballs around, right? Even in Path of Exile, if you're like, I want to be a character that throws fireballs, because I think conceptually, right, because it's an action role-playing game with so much focus on the action role-playing part, you sort of, your basis for playing a role gets kind of boiled down to the fantasy of like, okay, my fantasy is being a guy that throws fireballs, right? That's sort of my fantasy. I want to be a guy who throws fireballs really good. And my friend is a guy who summons zombies from corpses really good, right? Or my other friend, they want to throw a shield at someone, kind of like Captain America or whatever, right? It's based around the sort of innate method of attacking, right? Or similarly, there's other systems in like a Soulsborne, very action role-playing game, but a lot of that is in service of a lot of that leveling system. I actually don't really like the leveling system in that, now that I think of it. In a Soulsborne game, I don't really like it because I find it kind of uninteresting, because so much of it, which isn't to say it's necessarily bad, it's just uncompelling, because I think that the leveling system in a Soulsborne game exists purely to further enhance the already amazing systems that exist by way of the equipment, right? So your own character levels and stuff, you're just like, you're getting stats and stuff like that, right? You're not like getting any perks, you're not making meaningful tweaks when it comes to your leveling. What is being meaningfully tweaked is your equipment, Are you a character wearing really heavy armor? Are you a character that can roll really quickly? Are you a character that is good at blocking? Are you a character that uses a really heavy weapon, one that uses lighter weapons? That sort of thing. Like I said, very much it depends on the type of game. But true enough, I like it more in those games when I'm allowed to tinker around and experiment more. The more freedom you give me to sort of toy around with my build, give me like respecs and stuff like that, I enjoy that so much more. But similarly, they are catering to that sort of archetype, this sort of like player fantasy. It could be something as simplistic as, like I said, I want to be a character that is really good at throwing a fireball, It could be something as banal as that in an action-focused action role-playing game, or it could be something as complicated as like, oh, I'm playing Disco Elysium. I want my character to be like a fascist. I want my character to be a fascist. There needs to be a set of skills and all of that sort of enable you to roleplay and make dialogue choices within that system to feel like, oh yeah, my character is definitely a fascist or whatever, right? Or better yet, you could be like, oh, my character just is really focused on money, right? And like hustling and grinding, in that game. And there are a lot of skills and stuff that you can combine together to sort of fulfill that fantasy. And at the same time, you can sort of tweak them as well. Not so much in the middle, but it really nails the fantasy. That's what I'm saying. I think there's such a key balance to like enabling the player fantasy and allowing for tweaking and all of that. I think people are more forgiving of there being less availability for you to tweak your character if, progression is faster or if replayability is really high. This was a big point in Pillars of Eternity, from the jump from Pillars of Eternity 1 to Pillars of Eternity 2, which is a CRPG that I really, really like the sort of systems and skills behind, because it allows you to create such interesting and unique characters. The very way in which the attribute systems are set up lends itself to that. For instance, in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, hang on, let me go back a bit. What I love so much about PoE 2 over 1 is that you just get respecs. I don't believe in PoE 1. There's either very limited respecking because it's meant to be like emulating Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. It's meant to be very reverent of those games. But in Pillars of Eternity 2, you can just pretty much respec willy-nilly as much as you want. You can't like change your class fully like some other role-playing games and stuff, but it is very neat. But for example, what I really enjoy about Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, is, for instance, like I said, the attributes. They're not focused specifically on one type of, like, action, if that makes sense. More so your, like, role. So, for instance, might exists as an attribute in Pillars of Eternity. Might can be used effectively by both, like, I don't know, I forget the term, a fighter or warrior, but it can also effectively be used by, like, a spellcaster, any number of spellcasters, because might doesn't influence your physical strength or whatever. It influences the power innate to any of your attacks, that being your ability to throw a punch or, like, swing a hammer, or your ability to throw a fireball and how powerful that fireball is. So you sort of open up to very fascinating character builds because it allows for so much interesting freedom. The issue, of course, comes that some builds are significantly more powerful than others, especially because you kind of have to balance the game around everything being viable in some sense or the other. So you want to shore up what's sort of like behind a little bit. You want to shore that up a bit. And probably okay if you let the stuff that's like wildly powerful, if it just stays up there, right? Because I think most players, especially when you're getting into that, most people know, oh yeah, I'm going with a very overpowered build. If I didn't want this to be this amount of easy, I wouldn't opt into min-maxing. Like you're consciously making the decision, I'm going to min-max. I'm going to make this easier for myself. In the same way, like in plenty of our playthroughs, especially in BGS games, which are, at least for me, given having played them so frequently, they're a little bit easier than on average. So For instance, in our current Fallout 3 playthrough, I'm not really wearing armor. I'm walking around in a sweater vest, right? It's a self-imposed limitation. But that's neither here nor there. In Pillars of Eternity, what's really cool is you could be a wizard who throws fireballs, shoots out lightning. Similarly, you could be a wizard who, and this is common enough in fantasy tropes, right? You could be a wizard that can shoot a gun really well, right? You're good at shooting a gun. You've got like a black powder rifle, and you're pretty good at it. Your wizardly abilities help enhance that. You could be a wizard who is a tank, who can run up and like you're walking around with a shield, right? You're absorbing blows for the enemy or for your team against the enemy, stuff like that. I think the Pillars sort of skill and attribute system is really, really good. I'm really enjoying at present the Baldur's Gate 3 one, right? Which is heavily and in many places directly inspired by Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. I'm very much enjoying that as well. And that Baldur's Gate 3 also allows for a ton of experimentation because sort of respecking your character is so accessible and cheap, and it exists very early on in the game, and I absolutely love doing it, probably to a fault. And like I said, a lot of it is balancing that the joy of like tinkering with it alongside the joy of fulfilling some sort of class fantasy, some sort of idea like, oh, I want to be the character who wields a shield and a hammer, and I walk in to a great big fight and everybody's trying to kill me, but they just can't, right? Or similarly, if you have a bit more of a like defined world or whatever, you could also have it to where I think Josh Sawyer talked about this on his channel a while back, about Fallout New Vegas supporting a lot of different class fantasies and stuff like that, or character fantasies, I should say, wherein, oh, you could be sort of a like wild scientist or whatever, and you're really good at using energy weapons and stuff like that. Or we want to make sure that there are perks and stuff in the game that will help you out if you already know from the get-go, this is kind of a Wild Westy area. I want to play as a cowboy, right? And they have literally a perk in there, I believe, called Cowboy, which sort of enhances those things, and other perks that you can take as well that sort of enhance it and sort of build on top of that class fantasy, right? I think that's at the forefront of it, is letting you sort of tinker around in interesting ways, having your... And the purpose of tinkering like that is because there is an interesting way in which a lot of the skills mesh together, right? A lot of them function together in a very fun and interesting way, right? And of course, like I said, it's very difficult to say that there's just one that is superior, because I couldn't imagine, for instance, an Elder Scrolls game wherein you're existing in that sort of fun sandbox and you aren't progressing your levels, your skills by using them, right? That's such a staple of that franchise. And I think because it's existed there for so long, it works so well in there, right? It is very fun to sort of think like, oh, I just did the Fighters Guild, so I'm really good at melee combat because that's my idea of being in the Fighters Guild, right? I want to go over to the Mages Guild. I'm not so good at that, so it does almost feel like I'm getting kind of a clean start in that sense. I've got all of my other like loot and items and stuff like that kind of built up. Maybe I've casted a few restoration spells here or there, but for the most part, I'm kind of really starting off new, right? You don't even have to do that, though, if you don't want to. It just sort of allows for this great amount of freedom in it. You know, so it's very difficult for me to say that there is just one answer for everything. Instead, it's better to take a step back and say, I love it when the game's systems sort of allow you to inhabit a player fantasy and allow you to tinker with it in fun and interesting ways, right? Either have it to where, like, for instance, your abilities work in a different way, it works slightly different, like I mentioned in Path of Exile. You throw a fireball, suddenly the fireball, you throw 3 of them, right? That's very fun and interesting. You can combine all that stuff together. That's sort of that's sort of the tightrope, the balancing act that you must work when you're designing systems like this, right? You want, I think, a measure of it being fun to tinker around with, and also to sort of enable the player to act within this world which you have built, right? And sort of live out the fantasy of being a certain type of character that exists and carries on within that world, right? I think that's at the forefront of it. Hopefully that's a good enough answer. I don't know that it is, because like I said, I don't really have one answer for everything. It really depends on the type of game, right? But if we are looking at commonality, that's the commonality, that you want something where you've got player fantasy at the forefront, and also at the forefront you've got your ability to tinker and have like satisfying interactions between your player choices. That could be like just what skill you're using, just sort of like different perks and how they mesh together, stuff like that, right? It's fun to have things like sort of working together in a very cohesive way, I think. And I don't know, I think that's kind of what most people do these days, right? I think most games do that. I think this isn't like I've delved into some sort of secret arcane bit of knowledge or whatever that nobody really knows about. I think this is just like a basic design principle. I think this is like most games probably do this, right? You approach it from your own angle, like I said, given whatever type of role-playing game you are, and you run from there, right? It's all about the player fantasy and sort of having fun with the numbers, even if maybe there aren't numbers, right? But to feel like a statistical, meaningful difference, right? And I do think you can run into trouble with giving the player too much freedom to tinker, right? That in and of itself is a bit of a tightrope to walk, because if you just let your player change everything on the fly, sometimes you wonder or you worry, do the choices still have meaning, right? Which I think can be fantastic if you can give, right? You want to give your player enough freedom, but still have it to where your choices feel like they have meaning and that there are stakes involved, right? I think you would want that, but I don't know. I don't know for certain, right? Because I don't think, right, Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have as many stakes, right? Because you can completely change your class, right? The only thing you can't change is like your character race, right? I think that's it. Otherwise, everything, your subclass, your primary class, you can just spec that out, right? Yeah. But I think that's, but at the same time, like I said, so far it feels like that isn't taking away meaningful choice, right? I don't know. It's a difficult one to think about. But like I said, I think most places do this already, you know? This isn't like some big secret or whatever. This is all just sort of how a lot of these games are made, right? All right. I think that ought to do it for this week. I thought that this would be a little bit of a quicker one. I probably should be trying to work in some quicker ones, right? I should probably work in a few faster ones or whatever, but maybe not too fast or whatever, but maybe it's just because I just waffle on for too long. Regardless, that ought to do it for now. As per usual, feel free to submit your own questions, and I'll add them to the ever-growing list. Until next time, please take care of each other.